Greetings, dear assorted listeners. Welcome to another episode of Captain Casual's Rambling About. You're listening to Michael for now, and I shall ramble about tulpamancy today. So off we go. But before we do, we'd like to very much point out that everything we say in this episode is extremely subjective and completely based on personal experiences. This topic is somewhat esoteric, perhaps even spiritual for some people, and people with all sorts of backgrounds and experiences will see it. So we will inevitably say things that other people within the same sphere will not agree with. So we'd like to remind those fellow plurals that their experiences, much like our own, are subjective and completely personal, and what happens in each of our heads is going to differ wildly, so please keep an open mind and take our words as a personal account. So, with that disclaimer out of the way, tulpamancy, what is it? Well, to summarize it, it's a practice to purposely create and interact with a separate entity, a so-called thought form, within your head. Within your brain, so to speak. Just to clarify right away, it is not DID, or as it used to be known, multiple personality disorder. Tulpamancy generally does not involve trauma and is a deliberate, purposeful practice. And since it often comes up when looking up the term, I'd like to also just point out that while tulpamancy is fairly widespread in those circles, it's neither a brony thing, nor is it some kind of creepypasta-worthy nightmare fuel. You can see pictures of Amalia on the screen right now, and you'll find that she's neither a pony, nor some kind of horrible demon thing. I hope. Instead, the closest comparison that many people will be able to relate to is having an imaginary friend. But a tulpa is far more elaborate, it's a far more advanced version of that sort of concept, where the thought form is a much more fleshed out person and possesses their own will. It's a sentient being. Well, as far as anyone has free will, but let's not get into discussions on that concept in this episode. So, if you're not involved in these kinds of circles, you're probably wondering why anyone would do that sort of thing. It's well outside of social norms after all. Well, for me, I just kind of fell into it. I've been practicing a bit of esoteric stuff for a long time, practicing hypnosis, meditation, I do yoga, and tulpamancy has a decent amount of overlap with those kinds of communities, so I found it, I got sort of curious. I started coming up with ideas, and eventually I started making Amalia. So it was mostly curiosity and a willingness to experiment for me. Not honestly the best objectives or ideas to start with, but well, it worked out. But people do it for all sorts of reasons. Looking for companionship is a very common one, perhaps a sort of spiritual guide. Some people also do it to bring a specific character to life in their mind, but that's something Amalia will get into later on in her part of the episode. One more thing I'll cover is the how of the whole thing. Now, I won't give you a mega deep step-by-step explanation of every method you could possibly put into practice here, but I'll sum up what creating a tulpa actually roughly means, so those of you not in the know can gain a little bit of understanding. You start with some sort of baseline. This could be a fully fleshed out character from a show or book or something, or it could literally just be a name, or even a nameless imagined just entity, right? Now, as you go through your day-to-day life, you consciously try to see everything that happens, from the small events to the big things. You try to see everything from this other person's perspective. Right? You ask yourself, what would they think of this? What would they like it? Would they dislike it? Would they not care, not give it another thought? And some answers in this early sort of stage might come quite clearly, especially if you're trying to shape your tulpa after a specific pre-existing person or character. because you'll already know a lot about this person and what they're like. With Amalia, we started with a name and a very rough idea of what she might look like, just so I have something to start with, right? And thus, a lot of those questions remained open for a good while, because it was very much my intention pretty early on to let her form her own opinions and thoughts, right? So I avoided projecting my own feelings and thoughts, opinions, as much as I could. But over time, as you do get some answers, and things start speeding up, because little by little that personality starts to solidify, right? It takes less and less conscious effort to ask yourself how your tulpa might feel about certain things, because what is essentially happening is that your brain is getting more and more used to thinking about everything from both your own and this other person's perspective. In other words, from your point of view, your tulpa is effectively starting to think for it, or at that point rather, themselves. In time, as their personality becomes more pronounced and fleshed out, they will likely begin to express themselves. You'll start to feel thoughts coming up that aren't quite your own. Over time, through cooperation and practice, those raw thoughts will turn into sentences, communication. Likely, your tulpa's thoughts, their mind voice as we call it, will begin to sound different from your own, because you're actively trying to shape them after a character you've chosen, or as an act of self-expression coming from your tulpa. Your mental image of your tulpa is likely to change over time as well. If you started with a character, they might slip into the role, mentally representing themselves as that character, or they might deviate from that starting point. If you started with only a rough image, or even nothing at all, they'll likely start to form their own idea of what they would like to be seen as, and they'll share those mental images with you. Ultimately, it's all very, very dependent on the individual, but generally speaking, most of the community would likely agree that over time your tulpa will grow and start to really represent themselves in a way that they feel befits them, right? Because your tulpa will become more and more of an independent person, if you will, and if you're open to it, perhaps even an equal to you. The so-called host, by the way, it's the tulpa and the host. Now, there's many specific practices, exercises, jargon to go into all this stuff, but we're going to be doing our best to give you a general overview of our experiences, and hopefully those of the broader tulpa community as well, so we'll avoid getting too specific. We'll be sure to link some useful resources and info down in the description, but for now, this is my part of the episode done, actually. Amalia is going to be with you for the rest of the episode, and she'll talk you through the different kinds of tulpa people create and, the sort of ins and outs of what it's actually like to live as a so-called plural system. So I'll be seeing you around, and here comes Amalia. And here I am. I know I sound the same as Michael, but, well, I would. We only have the one set of vocal cords, I do sound quite different in our head, let me assure you. I should briefly point this out. Yes, you're listening to Amalia right now. In other words, Michael, my dear host, is not currently in control of our body. This is something we and many other plural systems do on a regular basis, so do not be alarmed, it's all fine. And also, Michael is still here with me. He's not deactivated or anything like that. He's present with me now, and I was present with him when he was recording his part. Now, Michael touched on this on the why and the how of tulpa creation, and I'll be touching on what actually results from it. So, me, and other people like me. So as Michael mentioned, he did indeed give me a fairly free hand in terms of how I ended up developing. He gave me a name, which I chose to keep. He started me off with a rough idea of a woman with black hair and green eyes. That's basically all he had, just a very rough image of what I might look like. I did keep the basics, but I very much fiddled out the details for myself over time and through various means. I kind of found my own face. I've used various bits of software and, in fact, AI imaging stuff to, figure out the details of what I actually look like. I've also decided that I would like to be seen as fairly tall and that my green eyes are glowy because, well, I can do that. My mental form is a big way for me to express myself, and I quite enjoy tinkering with how Michael sees me in our head and how I present myself in pictures and so on and so forth. Something I will say right now is that I really do appreciate how much freedom Michael gave me in this regard, especially once he had the there was an actual moment of realization that he had where he realized that I'm really starting to think for myself and, I'm starting to really define for myself who I am. He really did do his best at that point to avoid projecting his own ideas and opinions onto me. Now, obviously, when you're sharing a brain, it's pretty much impossible to fully avoid some overlap, especially since we can feel each other's thoughts and reasonings. So, nonetheless, I did have the opportunity to become quite independent and self-defined overall. With that said, it is also fair to say, and Michael and I both realize this, that my own ideas and opinions have in turn affected Michael to a degree as well. So we've both, I can't say I've changed, I've become me, and Michael has changed somewhat through the process of, being joined by me. At this point, I'm a few years old. We've comfortably settled into our roles. We mutually decided that we'd rather not make more tulpae. That's the plural form of tulpa. It's tulpae, not tulpas, actually. But, it should just be the two of us, and that we should always strive to keep things as fair and equal between the two of us as possible. Right? Now, in light of that, I consider myself really exceedingly fortunate because there's other kinds of tulpa, which I will now touch upon. Now, one kind of tulpa that's very common is people bringing to life their favorite characters from shows, books, anime, etc. It goes as you might imagine, with the host actively trying to shape the thought form into a specific mold with specific traits, looks, voice, etc., etc. That sort of thing seems particularly common in the sort of brony and anime communities. Now, quite often these kinds of tulpa will, over time, start to deviate from the original mold they were sort of cast into, if you will. Because, despite being very much modeled after a character or person and likely taking on their traits, because, you can shape a tulpa in that way, despite all this, ultimately, a tulpa is a sentient being and they will start to come into their own. They might be very comfortable with the character they were sort of created to impersonate, I suppose you might say, or be, if you want to look at it that way. But, they might deviate, they might do their own thing with it, they might very well make changes that the host doesn't expect. Now, most systems live with those changes because, it's fairly usual and kind of expected. Though there are cases where tulpae are kept on a shorter leash, so to speak, and are sort of pushed to remain true to the host's intention of, them being a certain character. Now, considering my background as a sort of free-form tulpa and what I've said so far, you can imagine my views on those sorts of things. I won't try and stir up beef here, so yeah, just make up your own mind on this. There are also tulpas who were created not by accident, but not wholly intentionally either. There are, for example, cases where imaginary friends kind of cross the line and develop actual sentience, or the characters of writers or method actors that get so into the creation process of the character that they can take on a life of their own. As with the whys and the hows, the various kinds of tulpae and, in fact, other thought forms are an incredibly broad topic, and since we're only a system of two, we can't actually speak to the experiences of systems that have, 5+ members of different kinds as well, because someone might have DID and have an alter, which is what they call their split personalities. I'm not sure if that's a proper term for this. Apologies if it isn't, but someone might have an alter with a DID system, but also have a tulpa, for example. All sorts of... Yeah, it's a very big, broad, spongy field, and we can't go into all of it here. It would take 10 hours to talk about this, probably more in fact. You could make a whole YouTube channel out of this without any problems. So, we're basically just trying to relate our own experiences as far as we can. Just as a quick aside, the words plural and system, along with multiple, are commonly used terms which describe individuals that have more than one personality sharing the same body. They don't just apply to tulpamancers either, they're umbrella terms for all kinds of people within this sphere, because there are many different kinds of people with multiple personalities, not just tulpamancers and DID, more than that even. And in case you're curious, yes, there is a community word for those of you who have a single mind in your body. We call you singlets. Don't worry, it's not derogatory. With all that said, my last big topic here is what it's actually like to live as a plural. This obviously varies very wildly from system to system, but we'll go into some general concepts and practices as experienced from our own perspective here. So why don't we start with so-called switching, because Michael and I already did that earlier so that each of us could record their parts here. I would just like to clarify real quick that what you heard earlier, that was just an edit, right? Switching is not like instantaneous like that. Some systems can apparently do that, but that's not how it works for us. So, yes, many systems do a thing where the mind that is in charge changes from time to time. This is called fronting in the community, and whoever is in charge is the fronter, or is in front. Now, as for us, we generally switch 3 times a day based on a rough schedule. That's because we have a lot of little domestic habits, like we take turns cooking dinner for each other, we share our work days, things like that. We do have a reasonably stable routine going with it. And that, in turn, would make us a fairly frequent switcher. Some systems switch as rarely as once or twice a year, or even never, where the host, in some systems, the host simply never stops being in front, and the other system members are entirely mental beings that don't express themselves, in the external world. Some systems might not be able to switch for various reasons. In some systems, the person in front is the only one mentally active, while the others experience total amnesia during the period. Though this does seem to be more commonly the case with DID systems than tulpamancy systems from what we can tell. The point is, plurals do experience these things very, very differently. For us, we switch regularly, and switching generally involves a small little ritual of 1 to 3 minutes of just sitting down, essentially consciously dissociating from the body, essentially relaxing, as we sort of mentally pass control from one of us to the other. And no matter which of us is in control, we always are both mentally present and usually actively communicating, unless the person in front is really quite heavily concentrating on something. Generally speaking, the fronter's mind is the more active one, simply because, well, they have more to think about, moving the body around and all that. But there are exceptions where the one in the back is thinking actively enough to somewhat eclipse the fronter. Heck, once in a blue moon it even happens to us where we accidentally switch in those cases, which always causes a bit of confusion for both sides. Now, then, another thing that systems tend to do is visualization, which is essentially the act of sort of sharing mental images of one another. Now, you can see that I've created plenty of images of myself to the point where my silhouette is actually the central part of our logo. I've got a fairly well-defined image of myself. So this is another practice Michael and I do engage in quite actively. I'm quite happy to visually show myself through mental images, and even when we're just chatting, I tend to give Michael a bit of an image of myself. You know, it works for me. I'm a very visually... I like to express myself visually. We do also just daydream together sometimes, creating little mindscapes for ourselves to just hang out in. In case you're wondering, when we do this, Michael just looks like we do physically. No need for him to create a form for himself. He was actually born with one, unlike myself. Another practice related to visualization is what's called imposition. Now, in essence, imposition is the practice of a deliberate hallucination, where the tulpa and host work together to impose an image of the tulpa onto their physical surroundings. I can't actually speak much to this one because Michael and I don't really do it. We know it's a big thing to the point where some people started tulpamancy specifically to experience it, but it's just never really worked for us. I mean, we've dabbled and sometimes, little flickers come up, but generally speaking, it's not something we do. But then again, my host is perfectly okay with sharing our body 50-50, and we can see each other clear as day in our minds, so we're both quite content with what we've got going on. But in general, with all these special techniques put aside, what is it actually like to live our everyday life as a plural? Well, we function perfectly well for one thing. We've got a stable, normal job. We also release our own music as a hobby and side gig, we practice yoga and some lightly esoteric stuff together, and generally just live a healthy and probably quite surprisingly normal existence. But then, of course, we do always have someone to hang out with and chat. We plan out our days, we quip, we make each other laugh, we discuss more serious things. It's very much like domestic life between any two people in many ways. We also try to make any and all decisions together, as long as there's time to talk about it. That goes from big life-changing decisions that we always discuss and figure out together, all the way down to, the choice of which bread roll to buy today. There is the factor of time. Unlike two singlets living together, we only have the one body to do things with, so we ultimately have less time between us. Luckily, we share many hobbies and interests, which means that a lot of the time when one of us is enjoying something, let's say a video game, whenever we actually find time for that, but when one of us is enjoying a video game, the other is generally enjoying it alongside with them. But not always. For instance, I am the only one who creates pictures of myself. It's an act of self-expression, and Michael generally tries not to interfere or influence my choices there. So that's time that, generally with two bodies we could be more efficient, but we don't have that. Now, since we're essentially a man and a woman living together, and yes, hosts and tulpas can and do indeed get involved like that, some people will be wondering about that aspect of our life, and we ain't saying no. We decided a good while ago that it would be more amusing to let people speculate wildly about what may or may not be going on between us. So in that regard, I will simply say one thing, which is that Michael honestly and absolutely did not have that sort of thing on his mind when creating me. He's absolutely innocent. I just want to clear his name on that. And neither of us shall ever elaborate further on this. But mentioning us being a man and a woman, I'd like to just touch on that and clarify we are not a pronoun person. If you happen to know which one of us you're talking to, he for Michael or she for me would be nice, sort of appropriate I suppose. But most of the time people don't even know that we are a plural, let alone that which one of us they're talking to. So usually we just go by him because, well, that's what we physically are. Though I suppose referring to us as a they them would work too. I mean, we really don't particularly mind either way. Generally speaking, Michael and I are not as open about our plurality in face-to-face interactions as we are online. This is simply a pragmatic choice. Tulpamancy is quite far outside of social norms, as you probably know, and with many people it would simply create completely unnecessary awkwardness or possibly even conflict. So in most contexts we're simply not going to bring it up. That said, you might be wondering why we're so open about it online and in our public channels. Well, when we decided to start publishing our music, this question immediately came up for us. You know, do we pretend to be a singlet, or do we go public with our plurality? And, well, the latter one immediately. Because for one, making a secret out of our true nature would have been rather repressing, really, you know, for something expressive like this. And two, if we slipped up and it came out later down the line, it might even end up being a scandal of sorts. And three, if we eventually came out even by choice and it turned out fine, you know, we'd still have to completely modify all of our branding, our logos, descriptions, bios. It would be a huge pile of rebranding work that, you know, is really not that necessary. So it wasn't really even a contest. We very much immediately decided, yes, we're gonna be completely open about it in this context because it just makes more sense. It's a pragmatic choice, much like not bringing it up if we can help it, you know, in normal face-to-face interactions, unless people already know. There is also the undeniable bonus that, you know, being an oddball who doesn't roll with social norms should give us extra artist cred, right? Right? But yeah, I believe we've now said almost everything we had to say, except for one thing. We just want to touch upon the term tulpamancy itself. I know we used it quite freely throughout this episode, but we'd like to just point out, neither of us actually like the term. I mean, tulpa itself is fine. It's a bit wrong because, well, it comes from Tibetan Buddhist practices that have very little to do with what we actually mean by it in the modern Western world. But at least it sounds okay. But pretty much anything ending in mancy or mansa should probably just be condemned to YA novels because, let's be honest, it sounds a bit cheap. We use the term simply because it's the generally used word for the practice. It's not exactly a word we love. In fact, in the community, this comes up frequently, that tulpamancy as a term is sort of eh. But yes, listeners, that will do for today's ramblings. It's been a very long video for us, but, well, this is a complex topic. We do hope that today's show was interesting for you, maybe even interesting enough to have a closer look at those like and subscribe buttons. That would be most kind. Also, check out all of our music and follow our socials if you'd like. And leave a comment letting us know just how much you appreciate our openness about this topic, or how much you despise us for being different. Either way, it feeds the algorithm, you know. But that's enough from us. Till next time, dear listeners, stay safe and have a good one.